They say land doesn't just feed the body, it feeds the soul. When I first laid eyes on the rolling pasture land nestled at the edge of Willow Bend Ridge, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: stillness, not silence, not emptiness, just the kind of stillness that wraps around you like a thick quilt in the dead of winter and whispers, "You've found home." I was 52 when I bought the ranch, old enough to know better, young enough to do it anyway. After my divorce finalized and my kids moved out, I sold my contracting company in Houston, liquidated everything, and came looking for peace. The land had once belonged to a dairy farmer, a grizzled old man who'd passed it down for 3 generations before it fell into foreclosure. I bought it outright: 48 acres of hills, a neglected barn, and a stubborn spring-fed creek that cut across the lower meadow. No HOA, no neighbors close enough to see my porch light, or so I thought. I'd been here a little over a year when the trouble started. It began subtly, too subtle to notice at first. A white SUV with the words Clearview Estates HOA stenciled on the door drove slowly past my front gate one morning. I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were lost. Maybe someone's dog had gotten loose. Either way, it wasn't my business. That's the thing about people like me. We don't go looking for fights. We just expect folks to mind their boundaries. But the SUV came back the next week, and the week after that, always slowing down at the same spot near the fence line that bordered my northeast ridge. Sometimes it idled. Sometimes someone got out with a clipboard. Still, I didn't interfere. I should have. See, my ranch butts up against the rear edge of Clearview Estates, a master-planned suburban community with identical cul-de-sacs, manicured lawns, and smiling mailboxes. It wasn't always there. When I bought the land, I was told by the title company that the HOA had no claim on my property, no easement rights, no utility access, nothing. We were 2 separate worlds, mine older and wilder. But in their eyes, my ridge was nothing but undeveloped buffer land potential. It wasn't until late October, after a dry summer and a golden brittle fall, that I noticed something that made my gut twist. A series of small orange survey flags had popped up along the north fence line right on my side of the boundary. The first time I saw them, I figured maybe the county had done it, maybe checking erosion levels or mapping utilities. But the county never surveys private land without notifying the owner, and no notification ever came. I grabbed my GPS surveyor, the same one I'd used for years while working back in civil engineering before I moved into construction, and walked the fence. I still had my original plats. The flags were definitely on my side. Some were as much as 6 feet inside my legal lot. That night, I scanned the documents again. Everything matched. No easements, no encroachments, just pure deeded land. A few days later, I saw 3 men standing beyond the ridge, 2 of them pointing with long sticks, one marking with orange spray paint. I approached. They wore matching polos embroidered with the HOA's emblem, a little oak tree, inside a picket fence. When I asked what they were doing, one of them said, "We're doing preliminary layout for the storm basin extension." I blinked. "You're what?" "Stormwater," he repeated as if that clarified anything. "We're extending the detention system. This slope's ideal. Low impact grading, easy runoff. This is my property," I told him plainly. "No, sir," he said. "This area falls within the Phase 4 expansion zone." That phrase stuck with me. Phase 4 expansion zone. I'd never heard it before, never been approached, never seen a permit. I told them to leave, and to their credit, they did. But not before one of them muttered something about deed overlap and municipal partnership. That night, I called the county clerk's office and requested all pending development plans involving the Clearview Estates HOA. The clerk, a young guy named Ben, said he'd never heard of any expansion that touched my parcel. "You sure they're not just trying to bluff you?" he asked. "I'm not sure of anything," I replied, "but I don't bluff." I slept restlessly after that. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew the type. People in HOAs like Clearview Estates are used to getting their way. They're used to people rolling over, especially quiet ones, and they hate being told no. Over the next week, the survey flags tripled. They marched down the ridge like a silent army, zigzagging in parallel lines, sprayed with codes I didn't recognize. One morning, I found a handwritten note zip-tied to my gate. "Access needed for environmental assessment. Please coordinate with HOA. I didn't respond. I didn't call. I didn't coordinate. Instead, I printed 3 "No trespassing" private ranch signs and mounted them on the interior fence rail, one on each side of the entrance. I installed a motion-activated game camera in the brush near the path they kept walking. I waited. The following Saturday before sunrise, I heard the rumble of diesel engines. It wasn't just surveyors this time. A full backhoe and a flatbed trailer parked just beyond the HOA's paved service road. Workers in hard hats, unstrapped shovels and silt fencing. Orange cones lined up near the fence line. At 7:12 a.m., the backhoe driver swung his rig across the gravel path and crossed the fence. He started digging. I stood motionless on my porch, coffee in hand, blood boiling. They'd made their move. I didn't shout. I didn't storm down the hill like some wild rancher with a shotgun. That's what they were probably expecting, the kind of outburst they could twist around and report as aggressive behavior to the county or even the sheriff's office. No, I stayed calm. I watched. I documented. One thing about living on your own land for long enough, you learn when to speak and when to listen. Instead, I grabbed my phone and began filming. I walked the fence line slowly, deliberately, capturing every orange cone, every marker, every muddy track where the backhoe's treads had clawed up my ground. They had already torn up a 10-foot stretch of native grass I'd planted just 2 springs ago, cost me a solid week's labor and a few $100 worth of seed to get that slope stabilized after the rains last year. The operator didn't see me at first. He was too focused on grading, scraping into the earth like it owed him something. But one of the men, probably a supervisor, turned and spotted me filming. He raised his hand like we were old buddies, like he expected a neighborly nod in return. When I didn't wave back, his smile faltered. "Hey there!" he called over the hum of the diesel engine. "Just doing some soil prep. We're inside the buffer, shouldn't be a problem." I didn't answer. I just kept filming. That's when I noticed something strange. A clipboard sitting on the hood of the nearest work truck just behind their utility generator. I zoomed in on it with my phone's camera. The top sheet had a header. Clearview Estates, Phase 4 Stormwater Development. Below it, a rough sketch, a basin, a retention pond. But the layout bled over a property line marked in faded red, and that line I knew too well was mine. That night, I reviewed the footage 3 times. I took screenshots. I dropped GPS pins on a satellite map, overlaying them with my original deeded parcel boundaries. Everything matched. I even emailed a friend of mine from my days in civil engineering, a guy named Ellis, now working with the Hotz County's Environmental Review Board. I asked him one question. Is HOA allowed to conduct grading work across private parcels without a recorded easement or permit? His answer came quickly. Absolutely not. That's a violation of multiple local ordinances. Send me everything you've got. I didn't sleep that night either. But this time it wasn't from anxiety. It was from adrenaline. My hands itched with the need to act, but I knew patience would serve me better than fury. The worst thing you can do when someone's breaking the law is give them a reason to claim you are the problem. The next morning, I walked the property line again. That's when I found them fresh survey stakes driven deep into my pasture, bright pink tags flapping in the breeze. Not just at the edge of my land anymore, but over 20 feet inward. One of them was labeled Sway Basin Outlet Number 3. Another had a tiny laminated page attached reading, Planned Excavation 11/22. My calendar told me it was only 4 days away. I decided it was time to have a direct conversation, not with the workers, but with the people who sent them. I drove the 3 miles around the bend to the main entrance of Clearview Estates, where a small building sat behind gates, the HOA administrative office. It looked like something out of a lifestyle brochure, stone facade, white columns, fake gas lamps. I pulled into the visitor lot and walked straight in. The woman at the desk, mid-30s, neat bun, and a half-forced smile, looked up from her tablet. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to speak with whoever authorized excavation on parcel 38B, I said. She blinked. "I'm sorry, are you a homeowner?" "No," I said. "I'm the owner of the land you're digging into." That got her attention. After a short wait, I was ushered into a windowed conference room where a man in a navy blazer waited. He introduced himself as Clay Merriman, HOA president. Square jaw, manicured hands. Probably hadn't done a day of physical labor since high school. He gestured toward a chair, but I stayed standing. Mr. Travis Holt, I said, owner of the ranch that borders your northeast sector. He smiled thinly. Ah, yes, we've been meaning to reach out to you. You reached out with a backhoe, I said flatly. Clay cleared his throat and clasped his hands on the table. There's a bit of ambiguity with that property line you see. Our developers reviewed some older plats, and it appears there might be shared buffer designation under Phase 4's Regional Planning Overlay. Shared buffer, I raised an eyebrow. Funny. My deed doesn't mention sharing, nor does the county's database. Well, that's where interpretation comes in. These things can be flexible. We're more than happy to work with you on a fair agreement, perhaps even offer you compensation for cooperation. I stared at him. You're offering to buy access to land you already started destroying. He gave a chuckle like we were just having a lively, neighborly chat. Mr. Holt, let's not escalate this. It's just dirt. We're building for the community. Surely you want to support that. I leaned forward. What I want is for you to stay off my land. His smile vanished. That afternoon, I filed a formal notice of trespass and land disturbance without permit with the county's Planning and Zoning Office. I attached photographs, GPS data, my property deed, and the drone footage I'd captured the previous weekend. Ellis called me the next morning impressed. Travis, this is a slam dunk. Give me 48 hours. We'll send out a compliance officer. 48 hours later, 2 county trucks rolled up to my gate. I walked them out to the ridge. They brought measuring equipment, legal pads, orange vests. One of them, a woman named Valerie, whistled low as she surveyed the trench line. This goes way beyond what's legal, she said. There are multiple code violations here. If this isn't resolved by the HOA within 10 business days, they're looking at fines north of 6 figures. I nodded, but didn't smile. Not yet. The backhoe was still there, but it hadn't moved in a day, and now they knew I wasn't bluffing. The ground still bore fresh wounds, long gouges in the soil, torn up vegetation, and the unmistakable tang of spilled hydraulic fluid, where the backhoe had leaked under pressure. I stood at the top of the ridge that evening, arms crossed, watching the sun fall behind the barn and the shadow of Clearview Estates crawl back across my land. I didn't need lights to know where the damage was. My boots knew by feel. My land had been violated. The next morning, the HOA doubled down. They didn't send a letter or a representative or even an apology. Instead, another crew showed up, 2 pickups, a trailer, and a white SUV with the same tree in a fence logo stamped on the side. But this time, they brought in more than just tools. They had surveyors again, yes, but also a man in a sports coat who looked more like a corporate attorney than anyone who'd ever held a shovel. I watched from the porch, not bothering to hide anymore. One of the crew tried to enter through the old ranch gate, the same one I'd reinforced with welded steel a year ago after a coyote broke through chasing chickens. When he found the gate locked and the new signs posted, he turned and yelled toward the SUV. That's when the man in the blazer walked over, pulled out his phone, and started taking photos of the signs, the gate, even my mailbox. Then he pointed, said something I couldn't hear, and they began unloading equipment right there on the edge of my land again. They weren't just resuming the work, they were staking claim. I stepped down from the porch, calm but deliberate, crossing the yard with my phone already recording. You're trespassing, I said as I approached, voice level steady. The man in the blazer turned to me. Mr. Holt, I presume. That's right. I'm Greg Landry, legal counsel, representing the Clearview Estates Homeowners Association. We're conducting protected development work under regional easement statutes related to watershed management. I blinked. Protected by who? This falls under the county's Cooperative Zoning Overlay, Section 14C. It provides leeway for community water mitigation infrastructure where no active use of the land exists. No active use, I said, stunned. You think my pasture is inactive just because you don't see a strip mall on it? He tilted his head, in that way lawyers do when they're trying to seem polite but condescending. The area in question doesn't show any registered structures or agricultural development per our records. You mean the land where I run cattle part of the year, the slope I regraded myself to stop runoff from flooding my lower creek, the very ground you're standing on without permission. He didn't flinch. If you have a dispute, I suggest you file an appeal with the county. I already have, I said, holding up my phone so the red blinking light caught his eye. And they're coming back tomorrow with enforcement authority. He hesitated. Just a second. But I saw it, the flicker in his expression. Still, they didn't leave. Instead, they dropped new marker stakes, started laying out a thin nylon line across the earth like they were preparing for a permanent installation. A storm drain, a culvert I didn't know, but I knew it didn't belong there. That night, I sent a certified letter to both the HOA office and to Landry himself. It included the legal description of my land, a cease and desist demand, and copies of the filed complaint with the county. I CC'd Ellis Valerie from the inspection team and the local sheriff's department for good measure. I had no intention of being the one caught off guard. But then they made their boldest move yet. 2 days later, I returned from a supply run in town to find the northeast fence partially dismantled. They hadn't cut it, they'd unscrewed the panels with cordless tools, neatly removing a section about 20 feet wide, just enough to drive a skid steer across. The machine sat idling on my land. A new trench had been dug shallower than before, but freshly carved stretching along the property line like a gash. I could see their trucks pulled back along the HOA's access road and a small yellow excavator left beside my pasture grass, as if daring me to touch it. I didn't touch it. I called Valerie. What she said voice sharp on the other end of the line. They took my fence down, and they're digging again. This is retaliatory, she muttered. Give me 90 minutes. Exactly 86 minutes later, 2 marked county vehicles rolled up my drive, followed by a black SUV with government plates. Valerie stepped out in work boots and a ball cap clipboard in hand and began walking the site with methodical anger. By noon, I had a copy of a stop work order issued under County Ordinance 5.12. Unauthorized excavation on private property. It was stamped with the county seal and signed by the Deputy Director of Planning and Zoning. The order stated plainly that all operations were to cease immediately pending investigation, with failure to comply resulting in fines up to $25,000 per day. I posted 1 copy on the broken fence, another I taped to the skid steer's control arm. A third I handed to the HOA's landscaper when he came slinking around the next morning to check on equipment. And just like that, the digging stopped. But that didn't mean the HOA did. The next wave came not on trucks but on paper. 5 days after the stop work order, I received an envelope on county letterhead. Inside was a formal Notice of Disputed Boundary Line, submitted on behalf of Clearview Estates HOA. They claimed a 2-acre sliver of my ridge was erroneously recorded in my deed and requested a mediation hearing to resolve the discrepancy. It was a last-ditch effort, one that reeked of desperation and legal bluster. But I wasn't naive. If they could tangle me up in legal limbo long enough, they could argue for temporary access, use that access to finish the stormwater structure, and then claim it as critical infrastructure. That's when I brought in backup of my own. A week later, my old friend Ellis drove out, in-person portfolio in hand. He brought with him 20 years of geodata overlays, historical plat maps from 3 different zoning periods, and a registered land surveyor from the state board. We walked the land together, placing markers, taking elevation readings, cross-checking coordinates. They even found the original boundary pins, half buried under decades of soil and roots, but still there. You've got them dead to rights, Ellis said, tapping one of the rusted iron pins. No matter how they spin this, the law's on your side. I nodded. Good, because they've been digging graves with that backhoe, and I'm done letting them do it on my land. I didn't want to go to the HOA meeting. I've never had a taste for theatrics, and everything about Clearview Estates reeked of performance. The way their entry signs changed with the seasons, the way they called every minor upgrade. A beautification project, even the way their president signed emails with, in Community Clay Merriman. But the letter I received, folded neatly in a gold-edged envelope, left me no choice. Mr. Holt, it began. You are cordially invited to attend a special board session concerning the cooperative resolution of property ambiguity on your northeastern ridge. Translation: they were going to try to talk me into backing down. So I went. The meeting took place in their community pavilion, a converted event space next to their artificial lake. It had string lights folding the chairs in tidy rows and a podium that looked like it had been borrowed from a country club. I showed up in jeans boots, still dusty from walking the trench line, and a ball cap that read, "This land was earned, not given." Let them see exactly who they were messing with. The room was already half full when I walked in, HOA board members at the front table, a few concerned residents scattered in the audience. Most people didn't know what was going on. They were here for their usual pet peeve complaints about fence heights and mailbox colors. But the board knew, and Clay Merriman definitely knew. He stood when I approached the front. "Mr. Holt," he said, smiling like a game show host, "thank you for joining us." I gave him a single nod and took the open seat someone had labeled guest. "We'll be addressing the item concerning Parcel 38B shortly," Clay announced to the room as if we were discussing landscaping instead of land theft. The meeting dragged on for 20 minutes, one woman arguing about trash pickup, another man furious that someone planted marigolds in an unapproved color. Then finally, Clay tapped his papers and turned toward me. "Mr. Holt, if you'll allow me, I'd like to speak candidly." "I prefer facts," I replied, "but speak however you'd like." That got a few chuckles from the audience. Clay's smile didn't waver. "There's been some confusion surrounding the boundaries of your property and the proposed expansion zone for our stormwater project. Our engineers, licensed, I might add, have determined that the ridge in question lies within a cooperative easement defined in the Regional Planning Compact of 2007. He even pulled out a binder and flipped dramatically to a highlighted section. I waited until he finished, then said, "You're quoting a compact that was repealed in 2012. The room quieted. A few board members shifted in their chairs. Clay blinked, then pushed on. "Be that as it may, we've offered you a generous easement buyout and even proposed an annual maintenance stipend. Surely we can reach an amicable arrangement." "What you offered me," I said, my voice, calm but loud enough to carry, "was a bribe to ignore the fact that your association illegally excavated my land, destroyed native soil, removed fencing, and trespassed without consent." Clay's mouth tightened. "You built trenches I continued across land you do not own. You removed boundary markers. You filed a fraudulent claim with the County Recorder's Office. And you continued digging after a cease and desist order had been posted." One of the board members, a younger man in a blue tie, interrupted. "With respect, Mr. Holt, do you have proof of these claims?" "I do," I said, pulling a folder from my coat. Inside were photos, time-stamped drone footage, the county's stop work order, copies of my deed and plat overlays, and even Valerie's written inspection report. I passed the folder across the table to the board. It landed like a grenade. Blue Tie's eyes went wide. The woman next to him leaned in, whispered something. Clay flipped through the photos with increasing speed until finally slapping the folder shut like it burned him. "This isn't how we conduct community dialogue," he said, trying to regain his rhythm. "This is a cooperative neighborhood. We don't escalate. We mediate." "You escalated when you brought a backhoe across my fence line," I replied. "You mediated with diesel engines." Another pause. This time I saw the board members looking to each other, not to Clay. The HOA secretary, a woman named Alm Fran, who looked like she had seen enough of these power plays to last a lifetime, finally spoke. "Mr. Merriman, I think we need legal counsel present before we continue this discussion." Clay didn't answer. He stared at me instead, jaw tense. "You thought I'd fold," I told him, not raising my voice, not moving an inch. "You thought I was just a quiet rancher with no fight left in him. But I've defended ground before, in worse places, against worse men. That wasn't a threat, it was a truth. I served 12 years in the Army, 2 tours overseas. I learned early that bullies in suits are no different than ones in uniform. They only understand consequences." Clay stood slowly. "This meeting is adjourned." I didn't move. "The county's reviewing the full claim this week," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "They've already found violations, and the fines they're discussing, they don't come with discounts." That got everyone's attention. I turned to leave, pausing just long enough to add one last thought. "You're not expanding into my land. You're going to be lucky if you keep your own." Outside, the sky was darkening, clouds gathering in a soft boil above the ridge. I took a deep breath, the kind that settles into the lungs like weight. Not weariness, but purpose. This wasn't over, not even close. But for the first time, I could see the cracks forming in their walls, and I was ready to push. I've always believed in the kind of power that doesn't shout, the kind that sits still while others panic. That was my father's way, and his father before him, men who understood land not just as property, but as legacy. The kind of men who didn't need to prove their worth in meetings because the soil beneath their boots had already testified for them. And it was that kind of quiet power I leaned into the following morning as I prepared my final case file. The Watts County Review Board had agreed to hold an emergency hearing. Evidently, my documentation and Valerie's inspection report had stirred up more than just HOA drama. It had tripped over a much larger concern about how Clearview Estates had been expanding over the past 5 years. Turns out mine wasn't the only boundary they'd blurred. I arrived early to the Call County complex, armed with 3 neatly prepared binders, one for the board, one for the county's legal representative, and one for myself. I wore the same boots and denim jacket I always wore, not because I had a point to make, but because I believed in showing up as who I was, not who they expected me to pretend to be. Inside the hearing room, the air was thick with fluorescent buzz and low murmurs. At the front sat the 5-person board, 2 city planners, 1 legal affairs liaison, a public land appointee, and the county engineer. Ellis was there too, sitting near the back with his arms crossed and a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. When they called my name, I stood and walked to the front, calm as stone. I began with the maps. 3 plat overlays from 3 different years, including the oldest, the one drawn by hand in 1969. Each showed the clear boundary line, unaltered by time or interpretation. Then came the deed documents, my property tax statements, and the GPS survey I conducted just 2 weeks earlier with timestamps and data signatures. No one interrupted. No one needed to. I followed with the drone footage. The room fell silent as the screen filled with clear overhead shots. The backhoe crossing the fence line, the trench being dug, the fence dismantled in real time. Then, a still shot of the stop work order posted and untouched, even as the skid steer continued to grade the land beside it. Finally, I presented the signed affidavits from Valerie, from Ellis, from the state-licensed surveyor. And then, the photo's bright survey flags driven directly into my pasture. One I pointed out was labeled Basin Outlet Number 3 proof they had planned not just to dig, but to install permanent infrastructure on land they didn't own. When I finished, I stepped back and said, "What they've done is not just a mistake, it's a pattern. And if it happened to me, it's probably happening elsewhere. You have the power to stop it." There was no applause, no outburst, just quiet. The kind that means someone is thinking very carefully about the next thing they say. The board recessed for deliberation. Ellis and I waited outside in the cold hallway drinking burnt coffee from a vending machine and talking about irrigation systems like we always used to. It felt oddly grounding. 45 minutes later, they called us back in. The ruling was unanimous. Not only had the HOA committed unauthorized excavation on private property, they had also violated 3 separate land use ordinances. And because the trench cut across a slope classified as erosion-prone, they triggered an environmental damage clause. The board levied a civil penalty of $150,000 with the order that Clearview Estates had 60 days to restore the land to its original condition, or face additional fines of $10,000 per day. But the best part, the county also voted to freeze all pending development permits submitted by the HOA until a full investigation was completed into their expansion practices. When I walked out of that building, the air felt different. It wasn't pride I felt, or even satisfaction. It was relief. I called my daughter on the way home. She lives 2 states over, raising twin boys and running a feed co-op with her husband. I hadn't told her everything that was going on. She's got her own worries, and I never liked burdening her, but that day, I told her the whole story. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Dad, you always taught us to protect what's ours. I hope you know you didn't just do that for yourself." I did know. Back at the ranch, I walked the ridge line again. The backhoe was gone. So were the survey flags. The wind moved through the grass like a quiet wave, brushing past the new fence panel I'd repaired myself the day before. I knelt at one of the old iron markers Ellis had uncovered and placed a hand on the soil beside it. Not everything that's worth fighting for has a flag. Sometimes it's just a stretch of earth. Sometimes it's your name on a deed. Sometimes it's the silence after the fight is over. That night, I didn't check my emails. I didn't look at the HOA's website or their desperate press release trying to frame the fine as a miscommunication. I poured myself a glass of rye, sat on the porch, and watched the stars slide over my land like they always had, uncaring, unwavering free. 3 days after the county ruling, a black SUV pulled into my gravel driveway. I was out by the barn repairing a rotted section of plank when I saw the vehicle kick up dust and come to a stop with the practiced smoothness of someone who knew exactly how far they were allowed to go without crossing a legal line. The engine idled. The door opened. Out stepped a woman in a tan blazer boots that weren't just for fashion, and a clipboard tucked under one arm. "Mr. Holt," she asked, approaching with cautious confidence. "That's me," I replied, wiping my hands on a rag and stepping around the post. "I'm Megan Ortiz, County Enforcement Liaison." She extended a hand, firm grip, direct gaze. "Mind if I walk the site with you?" I nodded. Motion toward the ridge. "You came to see what they've done." "I came to verify what else they may have touched," she said. "Turns out your complaint triggered something much larger." As we walked the familiar path toward the slope, I noticed she was scanning the horizon as much as the ground eyes, cataloging drainage paths, soil disturbances, the curvature of the land. "I've got documentation if you need it," I offered. "I've read your file," she said, twice. "Honestly, it's the most thorough case submission we've seen from a private landowner in years." "Used to be a site analyst. Before I ran the contracting business," I said. "I don't swing blind." At the ridge, she knelt beside the trench, scar now dry, but still fresh enough to be unmistakable. She pulled out a small measuring stick, recorded its depth, and took a few photos. "Did you notice any runoff patterns changing since the dig?" she asked. "Actually, yes. 2 mornings ago, I found a new silty stream forming about 30 feet down the east slope. Wasn't there before." She frowned, making a note. "That's going to be a problem for them. Altering watershed flow without permit is a big deal, especially if it crosses onto adjacent property." "What's bigger than $150,000? I asked, half serious. She looked up. "Loss of development certification." That stopped me. "They're under a full site audit now," she continued. 3 other landowners have come forward. One believes they poured concrete footers a foot inside his parcel boundary last year. Another says HOA staff cleared trees on a wooded easement without any arborist report. "So I wasn't the first." "You were the first to prove it," she said. The wind blew hard across the ridge, then lifting Megan's blazer slightly and carrying the dry scent of disturbed soil and early winter air. She stood dusted off her knees and looked out over the pasture. "This is good land," she said quietly. "It is," I replied. "They saw it as empty. I see it as home." That night, my inbox filled with county notifications. The HOA had been issued a notice of development moratorium. All current and pending construction plans had been suspended until further notice. The county engineer had also launched an investigation into Clearview's expansion approvals dating back 5 years. If any pattern of misrepresentation or falsified permits was found, the association could be forced to tear down or retrofit large portions of infrastructure already built. It was the kind of institutional firestorm most HOAs aren't built to survive. And then something unexpected happened. An anonymous email landed in my inbox. The subject line read, "They're turning on each other." The message was short, just 2 sentences. "I served on the HOA board for 5 years. This isn't the first time Clay and his buddies pushed something through by bending rules. There's documentation in the Phase 3 folder. Look for files marked internal." It wasn't signed. No traceable metadata, but I knew in my gut it was real. I forwarded it to Valerie Ellis and Megan. Within the hour, the county had subpoenaed Clearview's internal records. Later that week, a former HOA treasurer publicly resigned. She issued a written statement alleging that the board had bypassed votes, backdated permits, and pressured local surveyors to approve boundary lines that no longer matched the registered plats. The press got wind of it. And then came the part that made me stop in my tracks. One of the board members filed a formal complaint naming Clay Merriman as the person who authorized the trenching project on my land, knowing full well it was private properties. He'd even used HOA funds to pay off a freelance excavation company under the table to avoid drawing attention to the county permit office. Fraud, trespass, misuse of association funds. It was all unraveling. But I didn't celebrate, not yet. I still hadn't seen a single apology. Not from Clay, not from the board, not from the lawyers who walked my fence line like they were entitled to every inch of it. What I got instead was a letter, a sleek envelope, no return address. Inside on expensive paper was a bland corporate-style apology written in legalese. "We regret any confusion regarding the boundary line and remain committed to collaborative solutions." I folded the letter once and slid it into my firewood stove. That's not how this ends, I thought. The next morning, Megan called me again. "We found it," she said.
Found what?
"The internal notes. They had detailed drawings showing your parcel clearly labeled not HOA owned. They knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't say anything at first. Just sat down on the porch steps, phone pressed to my ear. "You were right to push," she added. "No," I said finally. I was just the first one who didn't move when they leaned in. The silence on the other end of the line told me she understood exactly what that meant. It didn't happen all at once. The unraveling of an HOA, especially one as deeply entrenched and obsessively organized as Clearview Estates, doesn't explode like a firecracker. It crumbles like a dry stone wall, one undermined brick at a time, until suddenly the whole thing leans too far and collapses under its own weight. And from where I sat at the edge of my porch with a mug of black coffee and a clean view of the ridge they'd tried to steal, I had the front row seat to every fractured moment. The first real crack came in the form of silence. No one from the HOA office returned my calls, not that I had many left to make. But when Megan Ortiz needed to deliver official notice of further violations, she told me their office was suddenly unavailable for in-person inquiries. Their website went offline that same day, replaced by a default hosting message. And the HOA's once weekly newsletter, normally brimming with notices about pet leash lengths and fence stain requirements, went eerily dark. The second crack was louder. It was a resident, a man in his late 40s, who pulled up to my gate one morning in a dusty SUV. He stepped out nervously, holding a folder in his hand. I recognized him vaguely from the HOA board meeting weeks earlier, one of the few who had kept quiet while Clay Merriman tried to bury me in zoning doublespeak. "Mr. Holt," he said cautiously. "Depends who's asking," I replied. "My name's Keith Donner," he said. "I'm a homeowner in Clearview, been here 12 years. I served on the board briefly. I resigned last night." He looked down at this folder. "I wanted to give you something." I motioned for him to come through the gate. He did hesitantly, like he expected me to slam it shut behind him. We sat on the porch while he opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, board meeting minutes, and internal memos. Most were from Clay. A few were from the association's project manager. "They knew the boundaries," Keith said. "They got your land survey months before the digging started." Clay dismissed it. Said if we pushed the trench fast enough, the county would rubber stamp it later. "And you went along with it." "For a while," he admitted. "But I started digging too, just not with machinery. Found inconsistencies in invoices, backdated authorizations, and some payments that don't match any contractor on file." "What kind of payments?" "To companies that don't exist," he said. "And to one that, get this, was registered by Clay's cousin." I sat back in my chair, letting that sink in. "This is all in the file?" I asked. He nodded. "Megan should have it already, but I thought you deserved to see it firsthand." He stood after that like he didn't want to linger too long. Before he left, he paused and said, "Not everyone in that neighborhood agrees with what they did. Some of us moved there for peace, not politics." "I believe that," I said. He gave me a small guilty nod. "I'm sorry we didn't stop it sooner." "You're stopping it now." He left without another word. The third crack was the one that changed everything. A full-page article in the Willow County Tribune, front page above the fold, featuring a picture of the damaged trench line on my land with the headline, "HOA Overreach Costs. Clearview $150,000 and more fines looms." The story detailed not just my case, but the growing list of violations stacking up against the HOA. It included anonymous board member quotes, whistleblower statements, and confirmation that county auditors had opened a financial misconduct investigation. Within 24 hours, the county's main Facebook page was flooded with residents from Clearview asking questions. Why hadn't they been informed of the fines? Why were their dues being used for unauthorized construction? Who approved the trenching on private land? And just like that, the HOA's wall of silence shattered. I heard that at an emergency HOA meeting that weekend one that had to be moved to a nearby school gym because residents refused to use the official clubhouse, Clay Merriman tried to explain everything away as a misunderstanding. He blamed contractors. He blamed clerical errors. He even tried to suggest I had given verbal permission for temporary access. He didn't expect what happened next. A woman named Marlene Standish, an elderly widow and one of the neighborhood's founding residents, stood up from her folding chair and interrupted him mid-sentence. "I spoke with Mr. Holt," she said, voice strong and steady. "He never gave you permission, and I'm tired of being lied to." The room erupted. Multiple residents walked out. Others demanded a vote to remove the board. Someone recorded the whole thing and posted it online. The video hit over 100,000 views in 2 days, under the title HOA President Melts Down as Residents Revolt. I watched it from my kitchen that night, the glow of my laptop reflecting off the window. I didn't smile. Not exactly. But I felt something deep in my chest, something I hadn't felt since the day I first set foot on this land, and knew it was mine. Then came the letter. This one was different. Typed on clean paper, no logo, no signature, just a direct offer. We propose a settlement of $175,000 in damages contingent on the withdrawal of your ongoing complaint and your agreement to cease further public commentary. They weren't trying to make peace. They were trying to buy silence. I didn't even hesitate. I forwarded the letter to Megan Ortiz and the county legal team, and then replied to the sender with 3 words, "We'll see you in court." That same day, Ellis called me from the county office. "Travis," he said, "I just got out of a meeting with legal counsel. They're not just pursuing code violations anymore. They're looking at civil fraud charges. The state might even get involved. What about Clay? Pending investigation. But between the paper trail and that cousin contractor setup, he's in real trouble." I exhaled long and slow. "Keep pushing," I said. "I will," Ellis replied. "But you started it." I hung up and stepped out into the yard. The sun was setting across the ridge, soft light catching on the old iron marker still standing near the spot where their trench once scarred the earth. It stood taller now somehow. So did I. The official letter from the county came in the mail 2 weeks later, sealed in a stiff envelope with a gold county emblem embossed at the top. I didn't open it right away. I sat with it for a while, fingers tracing the ridge of the seal like it was a warning or maybe a promise. When I finally did, slid it open and unfolded the contents, the words were cold and simple, but their weight hit me like a thunderclap. Final administrative enforcement order. Penalty assessed $150,000 here, dollars. Responsible party Clearview Estates HOA. Effective immediately. There it was in black and white. The fine was not just a number. It was a public declaration. A formal reckoning. A government body siding not with bureaucracy, not with an overfunded HOA, but with a rancher and the land he protected. It was validation plain and quiet. But the real blow came just 3 days later when the local news station aired a live segment from the Ott County Courthouse. Clay Merriman was standing at the podium, face pale but composed, reading a prepared statement. Behind him stood 2 lawyers, tight-lipped and uncomfortable. He tried to spin it as a misunderstanding again. He claimed the HOA acted in good faith, based on ambiguous land records and a clerical misalignment. But this time there were no applause lines, no supportive nods, just cameras and silence. Then the reporter read from a county memo made public just that morning. The Clearview Estates Homeowners Association is hereby prohibited from further land development or excavation activities pending resolution of civil and potential criminal investigations involving misuse of community funds, document falsification, and willful trespass. Even in front of the cameras, Clay flinched. It wasn't over. But the tide had turned, and now they were the ones scrambling. The following day, a delegation from Clearview Estates showed up at my gate. 4 of them. The interim board president, a lawyer, and 2 residents I recognized from that fateful HOA meeting in the school gym. They didn't ask to come in. They stood respectfully at the gate looking at me, like people who had been sent to make peace but didn't quite know how. "We're here to apologize," the new board president said, a woman named Naomi Singh. She spoke softly with a notepad in her hand and nerves in her voice, and to ask if you would consider mediation instead of litigation. I leaned on the gatepost, crossing my arms. "Did Clay send you?" "No," she said quickly. "He's no longer involved in association decisions. He resigned officially this morning." I raised an eyebrow. "He's also under review by the State Board of Ethics," she added. I stayed quiet. Naomi took a deep breath. "Mr. Holt, the new board wants to make this right. What happened to your land, your property, was unacceptable. Many of us had no idea how far the misconduct went. We've submitted a request to the county to begin restoring the area under your supervision and approval." She held out a copy of a proposal. I took it, flipped through it. New fence, soil regrading, native grass reseeding, and a clause stating no future work would be permitted within 50 feet of my property line, unless authorized in writing. We're also authorizing full release of the HOA's internal records to the county, she said. All of it. Behind her, the lawyer nodded silently like his job was only to observe and document. You're not asking me to drop the fine, I asked. Naomi shook her head. We're not in a position to ask that, but we do hope you'll accept the restoration plan, and maybe someday a handshake. That last part stuck with me. They didn't beg. They didn't plead. They came honest. Late but honest. I'll think about it, I said. But I'm not promising forgiveness. You don't get that just because you stopped digging. I understand, she replied. They left quietly. I sat with their proposal that night at my kitchen table, lit by the soft buzz of the overhead lamp and the occasional creak of the house settling in the cold. I read every word, every line, and I realized something. This wasn't just about money, or land, or fences. This was about the principle that some people, no matter how organized, no matter how polished or politically connected, cannot be allowed to take what isn't theirs. It was about standing ground not just with words, but with evidence, with patience, with backbone. And it was about reminding people, those who'd forgotten, that real authority doesn't come from a title printed on HOA stationery. It comes from integrity. 2 mornings later, I met Megan and Ellis at the Ridge. The cleanup crew had arrived under county supervision. The same ridge that had once been chewed open by steel treads and false entitlement was now being restored by the people who had tried to conquer it. And me. I didn't say much. I just watched. I walked the perimeter, quietly made notes where the soil needed reinforcement, pointed out where native roots had been disturbed, and where reseeding would be required in spring. Megan nodded, jotting it all down. Ellis kicked the dirt once with his boot and smiled. Feels different now, doesn't it? He said. Yeah, I replied. It feels like mine again. When they finished for the day, the crew packed up and drove off in silence. No loud engines, no laughter. Just quiet professionalism. Respect. As the sun dipped low, I stood alone on the edge of the ridge. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out one of the original survey flags they'd left behind weeks ago, pink-bent, torn at the corner. I placed it in the ground exactly where they had started digging. Then I stepped back and crushed it beneath my boot. It wasn't long after the ridge was restored that I received a call from a man who introduced himself as Peter Langston, a representative acting on behalf of the Clearview Estates Legal Fund. His voice had the smooth cadence of someone who'd spent too many years in air-conditioned conference rooms with perfectly pressed shirts and too little dust on his boots. We're hoping, he said, to close the chapter on this unfortunate misunderstanding and avoid further prolonged legal exposure for all parties. I let him talk. Let him use phrases like amicable resolution, non-disclosure, and mutual interest. Then came the offer, a personal settlement. $250,000 deposited directly to me in exchange for signing a waiver that I would not pursue further public commentary, civil damages, or collaborate with media or county investigators beyond what was already on record. That last part was key. They didn't want to stop paying for what they did. They wanted to stop the bleeding. I didn't answer immediately. I just asked one question. Do you know what it's like to have men dig through your land at dawn without knocking, without asking? Like your name on a deed means nothing. Peter hesitated. I'm not involved with... Of course you're not, I said quietly. But you're here now after the storm has passed, offering sandbags like they'll dry my field. He didn't respond. I'll get back to you, I said. But don't hold your breath. I hung up and didn't call back. Later that evening, I received an email, same polished tone, now from a different address. It included a revised version of the settlement agreement. Higher number $300 or $1,000. Same conditions. But what caught my attention was the phrasing in the subject line. Final offer requires urgent consideration. Urgent for who? For the HOA, whose insurance was now refusing to cover costs associated with fraudulent permitting. For Clay Merriman, who had quietly retained a white-collar criminal defense attorney in Austin. Or for the remaining board members scrambling to convince residents that their dues would cover next year's landscaping and not another lawsuit. I forwarded the email to Megan Ortiz and Ellis with no commentary. I didn't need to explain anything. The next morning I received a letter, not from a lawyer, not from the county, but from someone I hadn't expected, a young woman named Sarah Hastings. She lived 3 lots down from the HOA office. Her husband was deployed overseas. They'd moved in 3 years ago, right before the HOA had begun quietly expanding its beautification initiative, which now included installing flower beds where none were wanted and building brick pathways across shared green spaces with no community vote. Her letter wasn't legal, it was human. "Mr. Holt," she wrote, "thank you for standing up." I didn't have the words, and honestly, I didn't think it would matter. But when I saw you at the ridge that day, filming the diggers and not backing down, I realized someone finally drew a line. And that line didn't move. She went on to say that more residents had begun questioning the fees, reviewing past HOA reports, asking for audits. A petition had started. Over 60% of homeowners now demanding the right to vote on HOA leadership changes. A recall was on the table. They weren't just fixing fences anymore. They were rebuilding their neighborhood. It struck me then how deep this thing had gone, not just into my soil, but into the spirit of the community itself. How an act of arrogance by a few had stifled the voice of many. That evening, I sat down at the dining table with a pen and envelope and my own kind of letter. I wrote directly to the county commissioner, not to complain, not to demand, but to recommend that the funds collected from the HOA fine be used to establish a landowner rights education program. A free series of public workshops for new property owners, HOA members, and rural residents covering topics like easement law, environmental code, and development permits. I told them that if my fight meant anything, it should mean this fewer people having to fight in the first place. A week later, I received a reply. They loved the idea, and they wanted me to help design it. I'd never seen myself as an activist. Hell, I still don't. I'm a rancher. I fix gates and mend fences. I raise crops and drink coffee before the sun's fully up. But I know this: you don't need a podium to make change. Sometimes you just need to say no and mean it. On a warm Friday morning in early spring, I saw the last of the restoration crew drive off my property. They'd planted native grass seed, added runoff barriers, even hand-packed topsoil where their machines had torn too deep. The new fence gleamed with clean rails and solid welds. I stood at the corner post, hand on the cool metal, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, like a storm had passed, and not everything was dry yet, but the foundation had held. Later that day, I saw a familiar car pull up to the fence. It was Naomi Singh, the new HOA president, alone. No clipboard, no entourage. She stepped out and walked to the gate. "I came to return something," she said, holding out a small tin sign, one of the no trespassing placards they had removed early on during the trenching. I took it, flipping it over in my hands. "It was wrong what we did," she said. "And I know it doesn't undo anything. But I hope it means something." "It does," I said. She looked relieved, then asked, "Are you still planning to testify at the board review?" "I am." She nodded slowly, then added, "Good. They need to hear it." And then she left. No arguments, no persuasion, just respect. That night, I nailed the old sign back onto the fence post, not because I needed a warning, but because it reminded me of what I stood for, and that some lines once redrawn never move again. It was nearly a year to the day from when I first spotted those orange survey flags on the ridge, when I stood once again on that very slope, this time under a wide, cloudless sky. Spring had returned. The wind carried the scent of new grass, and the soil underfoot was soft but solid, reclaimed not just from the machinery that had scarred it, but from the arrogance that tried to erase its rightful owner. The final hearing before the county board wasn't about my case anymore. That part was settled, signed, and archived. The fines had been paid. The restoration complete. Clay Merriman, as it turned out, was facing more than just local repercussions. He'd been charged with falsifying municipal documents and misappropriating community funds. He'd lost his standing, his reputation, and likely his career. But I still showed up at the hearing, not for vengeance, and not even to watch the last nails go into the coffin of the old board's regime. I went to speak. I told them about the ridge, how it wasn't just soil and drainage and square footage. I spoke of what it meant to inherit land, to walk boundaries your father once walked, to restore a place with your own hands and your own sweat. I told them how much harder it is to build something than to take it, and how easily we forget that when paperwork starts replacing principles. And I asked them plainly, what's the cost of a mistake like that? And who pays when we pretend the land can't speak for itself? They didn't interrupt me. Not once. When I stepped down from the dais, I didn't feel applause or fanfare. Just a quiet, collective stillness. The kind that comes when truth settles in a room like dust, and nobody dares disturb it. Afterward, Ellis clapped me on the shoulder outside the building. "You always had the better words," he said. "No," I smiled. "I just had more time to think." The county commissioner later told me that several members of the planning board had cited my testimony as the turning point in their vote to restructure how HOAs interact with county zoning departments. They passed a new measure within weeks, requiring third-party oversight for all HOA development plans near private land. That was more than I expected, more than I had hoped for. But maybe the most surprising thing happened in my own mailbox 2 weeks later. It was a letter, handwritten, careful penmanship. From a Marlene Standish, the widow who stood up in that HOA meeting who shut Clay down with her courage when most still sat in silence. Mr. Holt, she wrote, I thought I was the only one who still cared about boundaries, about what's fair. I was wrong. Thank you for reminding me and all of us that sometimes we have to stand in front of the storm instead of waiting for it to pass. Inside the envelope was a simple wooden token, her late husband's old ranch badge from his years with the Forestry Service. She said she'd held on to it for decades, but that she believed now it should rest with someone still watching the trees grow. I framed that badge. It hangs in my workshop beside the original plat map of my ranch and a photo of my father standing in the same spot I had 50 years earlier, wearing the same look of quiet resolve. You see, I didn't just win a fight against an HOA. I reclaimed a promise to protect what was mine, yes, but also to honor those who came before me, to be a good steward, not just a loud one, to speak when silence would cost too much. These days, the ridge is calm again. The birds have returned to the trees the HOA tried to mark for removal. The fence holds firm, and the creek runs clean through the pasture. I reseeded myself one handful of soil at a time. No more survey flags, no more backhoes. Sometimes, I'll walk the perimeter at dusk, not to patrol, but to remind myself of what still stands. I'll pass by the spot where they first broke ground and pause just briefly to place a hand on the earth. And every time I think the same thing. They thought I was just a man with land, but I was a man with memory, with law, with will, and now with peace, because the land is mine and always was.